I'm on the bus and I'm in military uniform and I'm a soldier illegally in an occupied territory going to a military base. And I remember looking out the window and saying, this is a legitimate target.
A legitimate target. There's this narrative that's framed in a way that, all of Israel's problems are going to be solved in just the next election cycle.
The people in power in Israel are serious, as should be very evidently the case by now, about pursuing this zero-sum project, about pursuing a project of expulsion and eradication and of domination in the region. Even in your clinching argument for peace, you're dehumanizing the other side. And in a way, it explains why I'm here and not there. You got me to talk about things I don't talk about normally,
well, there we go.
Bravo to you.
This is Daniel Levy. He's a former Israeli negotiator who served under two prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin and later Ehud Barak. Today, he's the president of the US Middle East Project. But there's a journey here that I want to explore. From an Orthodox and Zionist upbringing in North London to moving to Israel in his younger years to becoming one of the most prominent voices heavily critical of Israel's actions against Palestinians today. So let's get into it. My name is Mohamed Hashem, and this is Real Talk.
Daniel Levy, president of the US Middle East Project. Welcome to Real Talk.
Good to be with you.
No, it's good to have you. It's such a pleasure. Look, the nature of this show, Daniel, it's quite laid back. So, I got my coffee. Yes, there you go. Like for the next hour or so, we're just, I'm your best friend. And you're going to tell me all your secrets. And that's how we're going to go from here.
That's how it's going to go. Okay.
You grew up in North London. So if I were to ask you, I don't know how possible this is, but if I were to ask you to try to detach your younger self from your current self, and we can kind of try to go back and think through those eyes, growing up in the UK, your relationship with Israel, your relationship with your Jewish identity, what was that like?
So on a very personal level, I grew up in a very Jewish home. That was very much part of who we were, who we are. Family is very central to me, to community life in the Jewish community. We're all still very close. Orthodox, Zionist, absolutely. The background of a family deeply impacted by the Holocaust there. Yeah,
you have family ties.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So on my mother's side, it was the smattering of members of that family who survived, the stories of those who didn't. My grandmother was a very influential figure in my life, and hearing from her what her family had gone through. And there was an implicit possible tension there between a Jewish parochial, particularist approach to the lessons of the Holocaust and a more universal approach. I think we always leaned into the more universal approach. But it was not an unusual upbringing. And what I think is more significant here is the moment in Jewish diaspora life, or the epoch in Jewish diaspora life that was representative of. So, obviously throughout Jewish history, there have been multiple strands, multiple trends. Jews have never been a monolith. Post-Enlightenment, you have all these different competing trends. Even after the state of Israel comes into existence, it doesn't immediately assume a centrality in Jewish life. My parents tell me that when they grew up, Israel was not such a central thing.
That is an interesting take.
Which surprised me.
Yeah, it's surprising me.
So by the time I'm brought into this world, that is changing. And that comes shortly after 1967. It then, I think, enters us into a phase where Israel assumes real prominence, real centrality. Zionist youth movements, which would be an obvious place.
Birthright trips?
Birthright trips is after my time, but there were things that were similar to that. not as much, not funded in the way that Birthright is, not as much of a rite of passage, but I went on a trip to Israel. So Israel increasingly also becomes the replacement for religion as the touchstone of identity. And I think that's where...
Replacement for religion.
Yeah.
Because that is something to underline there.
It's so exactly. And that's some years later, which is when Birthright starts, that's the impetus behind it. The impetus behind it is, oh my goodness, there's so much assimilation. And here I'm flipping a bit from Northwest London to the US, where we have the largest diaspora Jewish community by a long way. So everything in the Jewish funding world is quite American-centric.
Yeah, speaking of, because this reminds me of a quote, there was speaking of Jewish Americans, Peter Baynard, who I'm sure you know, he had a quote which was along the lines of, you can criticize religion inside a synagogue, but you can't criticize Israel.
In the United States, if you look at Hillel, the organization that works on college campuses, they say very openly to students, we don't care whether you observe any Jewish practice at all, but if you don't support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, then essentially you're not welcome here, right? To me, this is essentially what happens when you elevate ethno-nationalism, a Jewish state over Judaism itself.
I think Peter has helped a lot of people question a lot of things that we were brought up with. You know, we're of a similar generation. His background is South African American, mine's different. But I think we're both a product of this moment where you're funneled. And here I'm talking about communal life. You're funneled into a certain way of thinking about Israel, about your Jewish identity, about all of these things. And he has landed in a place where, it's a remarkable thing, but it's absolutely true what he's saying. You know, there are synagogues where you can, deny God, deny anything to do with the religious tenets of faith, but if you deny Israel, that's verboten. That's the red line.
The reason why I bring it up is to go along with what you were saying, that basically the idea of Israel started replacing religion.
So there's a panic around how do we keep Jewish kids interested in an era that's much more secular in general. How do you build a Jewish identity?
Post-67.
Well, here it's way post-67.
Way post-67.
We're talking late 80s, 90s. Mm-hmm. We're talking, we're also talking, the Holocaust is receding as a you owe it to the 6 million not to marry out, not to lose your Jewish identity. And that, as the decades proceed, and despite the very significant efforts still to make Holocaust so central, that begins to lose some salience as well. And so, then there were a lot of reports coming out in the Jewish world in that time. How do you get people back interested in their Jewish identity? And the thing that was alighted upon was, let's double down on Israel. Israel is kind of Jewish Disneyland. And that's where the idea of the birthright trips comes from, even before the birthright trips. There's also this moment. There's also this moment where it's like early 90s, peace process, Oslo, moment of optimism. Yeah. So that also is, maybe we can kind of peace, get people interested in Israel. And then it goes somewhere else, which is, as that optimism fades, Israel is held up not just as a tool for affirming Jewish identity, but it's about how can we do Israel advocacy where we keep people on board in an era where Israel is going off in a direction. Now, if I can circle back to an earlier thought, what I was trying to sketch out is that the first generation after Israel comes into existence, it doesn't have that centrality. And I think we're now in the end of an epoch where it did have that centrality. That's what I'm trying to drive at. That now the effort to pull things in the direction of this is all about Israel is bumping up against real resistance. It feels very forced. You need to massively resource it to give it a chance. You need to offer people a free trip to try and get them to get on board with this. And when you poll younger Jews, they increasingly are not buying it. There was this film, Israelism.
Oh, yeah, of course. Simone Zimmerman. Yeah.
So Simone, was the lead person in that. She's a generation after me.
Yep.
So I guess I come to this the hard way. I go and live there.
Yep. Which is exactly what I want to come to.
So we'll come to that. She's already in a generation where, if we want to go back to Peter Beinart, as he describes it in his book, The Crisis of Zionism, you were being asked to check your liberalism as an American Jew in at the door when you entered the Zionist space. And it increasingly didn't add up for people. And so I am of the opinion that the preeminence of Israel, of an Israel-centered way of being Jewish as the only way of being Jewish, it was never the case. You always had anti-Zionists, whether religious or leftist or cultural Jews, but it was so central. I think we're moving out of that era, and people are saying, yeah, I want to be religious without it being centered on Israel. How do I go about doing that? I want to have a strong cultural Jewish identity without it being centered on Israel. Perhaps it's centered on my opposition to Israeli politics, because my understanding of what it means to be a Jew is precisely not to do the things that country is doing. And of course, the way that country endangers Jewish communities overseas by the way in which it conflates. But I'm running ahead of myself.
And that's why you have people calling out the conflation between Judaism and Zionism. But we're going to get into that. There's a lot of elements that you touched on that we're going to unpack as the conversation goes. But I do want to situate you in all of this.
Okay.
Coming back to your journey. So you said you went to live in Israel. And there's a few highlights here that I want to unpack with you. I think, I believe that time was before the first Intifada. So would have been...
No, it's the tail end.
Tail end. So it would have been early 90s.
Yeah.
So it would have been early 90s.
Or just before the Wenger era.
Okay.
Arsenal Football Club. Had I known how successful Arsenal were going to be, perhaps I would have stuck around in North London, but there you go.
Well, I mean, look how well they're doing now.
It's a good time to be back.
It's a good time to be back. The highlight here is that you actually took a trip to Gaza around that time. I think you went down to Ashkelon, and then you got into a ride with a bunch of Palestinians and you went into Gaza. Can we unpack this trip? Because I also want to not only get the story, but I want to get your thinking process. Like, what's going through your head?
So I'm on a gap year, so I'm not living there yet.
Okay, so that's before.
So it's before I go to university, and I spend half that year doing a course at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Was I massively exposed to Palestinians, Palestinian politics, Palestinian thinking? No.
Really? Not even in the UK?
No, this is at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. This is before I go to university in the UK, where I do get much more politicized around these, but I was aware a little. So we were in Jerusalem, we talked to people. But what happens very randomly, I'm going to say this is 86, just pre-First Intifada.
Yeah, so that's before.
There's me and one friend. We're bored one weekend. It's Friday afternoon, so the Sabbath is about to begin. Buses don't run on the Sabbath, still true today in Israel. And we just said, you know what? Let's just go to the bus station and get the last bus that's leaving Jerusalem bus station on a Friday afternoon and just do something for the weekend.
To Ashkelon.
The last bus is going to Ashkelon, and we hitch I don't know why we end up hitching, but we hitch, and a Palestinian car with members of a Palestinian family pull over, and we say, where are you going? So we're going to Gaza.
And this is at a period where you've had very little exposure to Palestinians.
Yeah, pretty little.
Wow.
And we go, okay. So we go and spend a Friday evening, or perhaps it was even a Saturday morning. Maybe we'd stayed in Ashkelon and this was the next morning. It wasn't my only visit to Gaza. I went in other capacities later on. But yeah, we spend half a day there, I think. Perfectly
What
normal.
were you guys saying in the car? Even the hitch? Like, how did that even begin?
I wish I could remember.
Really?
I wish I had made notes at the time and I could remember. And then if I ever do a book, it would appear in the book.
Sure.
So if it does end up appearing in the book, it means I did eventually remember rather than I made it
You'll
up.
be back.
Okay?
Listen, we'll be back.
But,
we'll be back
but
talking about
I don't remember right now. No, I could make something up, but it would be made up. I can't
Well,
remember.
what about the time that you spent that half day? Is there anything memorable from that period?
I just remember, I think that the absence of a memory suggests
Right.
that this was normal and it was, nice conversation. And, it's only later on that the idea of me spending a gap year, of there being a program funded to bring someone like me to spend time in Hebrew University, to go on a tour at the age of 16, with the Zionist youth movement. It's only like, what was that trying to instill in me? Those questions came up more retrospectively than they did at the time.
Gaza at the time, someone like you going to Gaza, was that something that would have been vilified, that someone would have tried to tell you not to do, or was that completely accepted back then?
Perhaps people would have suggested not to, but not really. I think part of the story of post-67 is, of course, the imposition of an occupation, a military occupation, of Israeli military law, of laws that distinguished in different ways. You drew from Jordanian law when it was useful to you. So all these things are going on in terms of Israel's control of the territories. But it's also a period of relative openness. It's a period of relative openness for Palestinians in terms of reconnecting with what had been very abruptly cut between 48 and 67, right? So after Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians and the delineation of the post-49 armistice line, so the UN, I'll go back very briefly, okay?
No,
so
please.
the UN, where the majority of the commission that was set out to come up with what should happen to British mandatory Palestine as the Brits declared their intention to leave, there is a minority position and a majority position. The majority position of the states on that commission, of the members of that commission, was partition. And the UN suggests a partition plan, roughly 45-55%, 55 to a Jewish state that was going to be brought into existence, with a large corpus separatum around Jerusalem, parts of Bethlehem, that would be an international zone. But after the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians, because in the area designated as a Jewish state, that would have been pretty much majority Palestinian as well. And so the only way that that's going to work for this Jewish state, which is why expulsion is embedded in the project, was to carry out the Nakba. What that means is that Israel is in control, rather than of 55% of the territory, it's in control of 78% of the territory after 1949. And Palestinians are cut off one from the other. Some are expelled into neighboring countries, some into the West Bank and Gaza. Hence, when we talk today about the refugee camps in Gaza or Lebanon, Syria, Jordan or West Bank, that's where that comes from. But after 67, people are reconnecting. Palestinians are reconnecting for the first time. Now, obviously, on the Israeli side, some people are saying, hey, we have biblical roots here, we should be here, we could settle there. Things are relatively open. Israel also draws on the Palestinians in the now occupied West Bank and Gaza as a very convenient day labor force, for instance, as the Israeli economy grows. So the movement is very fluid. So there's driving into Gaza that weekend, there's no prevalence of military checkpoints.
It wasn't the open air prison that it became later on.
That's exactly. So then you have settlements there, but after the first Intifada is where you have the intensification of closures, checkpoints, restrictions on freedom of movement. After Oslo, that is intensified. And then, of course, later on, you have the hermetic closure and blockade, almost 20-year blockade on Gaza.
Okay, so that was highlight one from your time in Israel. Highlight two is you actually got to spend time, you got conscripted. You got to spend time in the military. What was the title? Was it a non-commissioned military officer or something like that? Okay. So that period in your life, where are you again? You become part of the military. Where's your thinking process? Do you start looking at the plight of Palestinians differently, or do you start realizing it in a way? How do you start analyzing it internally?
So that's 2 to 3 years after I've moved to live there.
Right.
Do I get called up for a year's military service? In the meantime, I've gone through the politics I go through at university in the UK. I've been elected head of the World Union of Jewish Students, which was the occasion on which I took up residency in Israel, changed my status, took up the second citizenship, have bumped up against the authorities there, the Zionist establishment, part of whom funded my organization, but then I invited someone to speak at our conference who was identified with the PLO, so I have a huge war with them, and the funding is cut.
Ahmed Taibi.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who now
he's a Knesset member.
Now is a Knesset member.
Yeah. But he's a Palestinian citizen of Israel.
Palestinian citizen of Israel. He was considered he was close to Arafat, and he was considered someone who kind of represented PLO positions, and so that was not looked kindly upon when I invited him to address the annual Congress of the World Union of Jewish Students. This is pre-Oslo. This is when there was still a law forbidding Israelis to meet with the PLO. He wasn't officially PLO, so that anyway. So I've gone through that, and in the time before my military service, in probably the year leading up to my military service, that's already post-Oslo. And I, at the time, am working with the two unofficial academics who led the Oslo back channel, one of whom has sadly passed away since. He passed away really quite young, Dr. Ron Pundak. So I've now been in lots of track twos. I've worked with Palestinians. The exposure has been very different to what it was previously. Spent a lot of time at Orient House in Jerusalem, which was kind of the unofficial PLO headquarters in Jerusalem before it was closed down. So when I get enlisted, and here momentarily my terrible memory was absent, and I had, I go in, I'm much older. I'm going in with 18-year-olds, because some people who move to Israel at a later age do a 3-month service only with other older new immigrants. I'm
mid-20s? You're mid-20s?
So I'm in my mid-20s then. I'm with mostly 18-year-old Israelis, a sprinkling of Russians and Ethiopians who are my age, who have come out there in different circumstances to me. And we are sent for a month's basic training in a military camp just outside of Nablus. And I'm on the bus, and I'm in military uniform, and I'm a soldier illegally in an occupied territory going to a military base. And I remember looking out the window and saying, this is a legitimate target. This bus full of soldiers.
A legitimate target.
This is a legitimate, under international law, you have the right to defend yourself and to oppose an occupation. We spend a month there. It's an interesting, different experience for me. I then spend time in the military, in a base inside Israel, liaison to the UN and international armies, and then I spend time during my military service in the negotiations on Oslo B under Rabin.
Yeah. You're working with the Minister of Justice, I believe. Or
That's later on.
that's later on. Okay.
That's as a political appointee rather than
Sure.
on military service.
But you're saying, okay, you spend that much time in Nablus. You're saying it was a different time for
It's
you.
outside Nablus. We're
Outside
not controlling
Nablus.
Nablus.
Sorry. Outside Nablus. But did it change anything inside of you? Like when you had that moment of realization or that thought of you saying that this is a legitimate target, did you build on that as the days and weeks went by?
So, at the time, I'm still of the opinion that this can be changed from within, that there is hope here, that I'm part of an effort to dismantle this thing that I found was not, it would be important in trying to win that argument amongst my new fellow Israelis. I'm still a new Israeli. And I didn't have to do this. I came here, I lived here, I've learned the language, I'm served in the military. That if I was going to build a future there, including a future where I was going to express political opinions, that I would be in a better position to do so. I finished my military service the day before Rabin
got assassinated. And that's highlight 3,
Okay.
which is what I'm about to get to. But forgive me for trying to oversimplify things, but are you at this point in your life, are you edging closer to, let's say, liberal Zionism?
Well, I would say that was the credo that I thought I came to Israel, assuming that this is an opportunity to not only live out where Jewish life was being determined in this era, but also to do it in a way that could somehow be faithful to liberal, progressive values. I also feel I've left Thatcher's Britain,
Right.
so this has got to be easier to change than Britain felt like at the time.
Wow. But how does it, hearing that back, how does that strike you?
I mean, I don't think Britain's gone on a fabulous journey since either, so it doesn't strike me as fantastical as I wish I could sit here and say it should. So it feels like there is a liberal Israel that can be victorious. And it feels like, and here, which I think is what you're getting to, that it's about peeling off the layers. So it feels like 67 is where there was a wrong turn taken. And if we could reverse the wrong turn of 67, then it could be okay, which is, if I'm going to be the one doing the simplifications now, that's the premise, I think, of liberal Zionism. That there is such a thing as an actual existing Zionist project as practiced by the state of Israel that can be liberal. And the 90s feel like, certainly the early 90s, certainly the immediate post-Oslo, feel like the vindication of that notion, right? Because, and here I totally get, and in many respects lean into, the idea that, of course, Oslo was to rearrange the fabric of the occupation, the first intifada. This is going to have to be done differently if it's going to be done successfully. But I'm not willing to entirely sign off on that, because I don't think fatalistic determinism is actually a great political creed. So the idea that if you just read Rabin's last speech to the Knesset on these issues before he was assassinated, it shows you he could never have gone on a further journey. I'm not willing to go there. I absolutely get the argument, but you also had, for all its faults at the time and its shortcomings, you also had a PLO, which was a real thing then, a Palestinian liberation organization that is not the hollow shell that it is today, that had gone along with this, that was coming back into Palestinian
heavily
occupied
criticized
terrorists.
for doing so.
And I'm fully aware of those criticisms. But could we have gotten to a place where 67 occupation was ended and then the initial inability of that to deal with 48 could have been dealt with in a different way, post at least a realization of initial deoccupation? I don't want to rule that out entirely. That's not where it went. And there are heaps of evidence to show that it would never have gone there and that actual existing Zionism was incapable of going there. At the time, there was a feeling of being part of a project that had various directions it could travel in. Some of them could have been positive. So that's the feeling in the 90s when I moved there. That's the feeling kind of during the time in military service, being on the negotiating team, with caveats.
You know what? This might be a good segue to read you. Speaking of Oslo, and I'm not going to get too hung up on it, but there's a quote that I found by the late Edward Said, and he was obviously a huge critic of Oslo, a huge critic of Arafat as well, to put it mildly. But he wrote this in 2000 in his book, The End of the Peace Process. So he says, "No negotiations are better than endless concessions that simply prolong the Israeli occupation. Israel is certainly pleased that it can take the credit for having made peace and at the same time continue the occupation with Palestinian consent." That is what he wrote.
And I would fully endorse that. So he's absolutely right. What I experience is what's really going on here. And that's where the experience in the negotiations and the experiences subsequent to that lead me to use that word again, the journey that gets me to where I am. Because if this is about wronging the right of 67, then when Israel got to yes with the PLO, when the PLO said, okay, a Palestinian state on 22% of the land, not only should Israel have grabbed that with two arms, it should have said, you know what, that's the only way that this can be dignified and sustainable, if that's what they wanted, something that could be sold to Palestinians, accepted by Palestinians as dignified. Israel should have gone the extra mile. Israel should have said, and, here's how we propose to, not in exchange for annexing territories for settlements, but if we're not going to accept the return of refugees, there should at least be an area, not the sand dunes of Chalutza, which was once near Gaza, which was once offered. Not only did Israel, having gotten to yes from the PLO, not accept that yes, it did precisely the things that Ed would say, refer to. And that's what I become directly exposed to. It tries to nickel and dime things to demonstrate that actually what was assumed to be that as long as you accepted Israel, recognized Israel, accepted even, and here, like I say, I don't think this was a sustainable position on the Palestinian side, to even accept Nakba, to not seek justice of a meaningful kind for refugees, that even when you got to that, it wasn't enough. And Israel doubles down on that when the Arab Peace Initiative is put out.
In 2002.
In 2002. So you've gotten to yes with the PLO. You've gotten to yes with every surrounding Arab state. It's endorsed by the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And yet, the The Israeli position is, how can we take more? Ultimately, the Israeli position is that actual existing Zionism cannot coexist with freedom, dignity, rights, the national collective existence of the Palestinians. That's the journey. Because it's not just me that's going on a journey. I do think Israel has gone on a journey. And when it was tested, the answer always, in the end, lent into zero sum with the Palestinians. And that's the journey that led to the ability to manufacture societal consent for the kind of genocidal actions that we've seen in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah. And another highlight in this journey, which I call highlight 3, is you said you finished your military service the day before Rabin got assassinated, which was 1995. Now I guess there's I don't know if it's like a full circle moment here, but there's a lot of significant things to stop at. One of which, the biggest one, is that protest in Zion Square that Netanyahu attended. This was before Netanyahu became prime minister. And then also, prior to Rabin's assassination, another figure comes on the scene who threatens Rabin, and he's the current Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir. How significant is this moment for you, but also, I mean, now that we're talking about it, the journey of Israel? Let's stop here and kind of unpack this. From where that was to, and in terms of where we are today and having these two figures in power.
So when there was a large negotiating team during Oslo B, I was part, just because of where I was serving in the military, of the delegation that was about handing over administrative powers in certain functional areas to the Palestinian Authority, and the negotiations take place in different places. I'm mentioning this because I vividly remember that on one occasion where the negotiations were taking place, this is a few months prior to the assassination of Rabin, there is one of those demonstrations has come to a lut outside the hotel where we were in the negotiations at the time, the Palestinians and the Israeli delegation. And one of the members of the Israeli negotiating team, more senior than myself at the time, a career officer, the TV's on, there's the scenes of the demonstration outside, and she says, "I should be out there with those guys, not in here with you traitors." She is now a relatively senior person in the administration, on the civil service side, political appointee of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The journey that Israel has gone on, I'd like to tell you that it's dramatic. It was unforeseen. But I fear that I'd be betraying things that I knew then already. Things that, not just that I hadn't processed, but I think things that the Israeli system hadn't fully processed in terms of what by then already a generation of occupation, following on from a generation of denial of Nakba. So the first, Israel is established on the basis of the expulsion, on the rejection of the idea that that expulsion has to be made good on, revisited. People are not allowed back. 18 years of imposing a military government on the Palestinians who stayed behind. So in what constitutes Israel proper then, on the 1949 armistice lines, the remainder of the Arab Palestinian population that is still inside Israel, some of them internally displaced, not allowed to return to their villages, all living under a military governorate. So these successive generations of refusal to come to terms with the Palestinians, as people who have been wronged, the refusal to come to terms with that initial injustice, the then heaping of the additional injustices of the post-67 occupation, that has already defined so much of what actual existing Zionism in practice is. But once you get to that moment of yes, once you get to that moment of, you know what, you're powerful enough to have dictated a set of terms that are not equitable, but we will go with them. That wasn't good enough. The way Israel behaved when it was supposedly under peace-seeking governments, that was already enough to indicate that what at the time probably seemed unlikely, that the guy who took the symbol off the car of Rabin, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and proudly displayed it, that the man who stood in Zion Square as people were holding up images of Rabin in a Nazi uniform, that those guys would one day be leading the country. Ostensibly improbable, but if you already scratched, not even very far,
if you were paying attention.
If you were paying attention. And it's also why it probably shouldn't surprise us that, forget Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, Netanyahu for a minute. Sure. Look at Bennett, Lieberman, Lapid, Gantz.
The opposition.
The huge quotation marks opposition.
Of course.
Who are no opposition whatsoever, substantively. So
that is actually an excellent point, Daniel, because...
Well, let's pause on it then.
Let's pause on it. Because, and I'll tell you why I want to pause here, because in mainstream media, a lot of it, American mainstream media, but some elsewhere as well, a lot of the blame just gets put on Netanyahu and the far right extremist government. And it's almost this, there's this narrative that's framed in a way that, you know, all of Israel's problems aren't going to be solved in just the next election cycle. We're just one election cycle away from making sure that we're going back to normalcy.
Yeah. Normalcy is now defined as apartheid rather than genocide.
Yeah.
And so if that's your bar,
that is the bar,
then maybe that's true, but that shouldn't be your bar. And that's where, you know, the veneer slips, that what, you know, the label was more widely attached to it as apartheid only in the past decade. But for Palestinians, it was a label that was used long before. And that's what we were inexorably moving towards. And, you know, just to open another Pandora's box, and going back to that Edward Said quote, the incredible success in picking apart the Palestinian national movement on the part of Israel, Israel's success in so doing, pulling it into Oslo. The absence across this expanse of Oslo of a fundamental rethink, re-strategizing, reshifting of priorities on the part of the Palestinian national liberation movement has unfortunately made the absorbability, the receptivity of that narrative of it's the extremists, they're the aberration. And even worse examples, which are, you know, it's the settlers. It's the settler extremists. And they are settler extremists and they do appalling things.
Or already illegal to begin with.
But they exist because they are an appendage of the state. They couldn't exist without the state of Israel. So when Europe places sanctions on settler entities, or when Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are sanctioned, it's a bad joke. The entire project is indistinguishable from the state itself. And, you know, it's this constant misattribution of causality and refusal to recognize, if you're being generous, what this project has become, if you're being perhaps more factually accurate, what this project has always lent itself to. And if you misdiagnose it, then of course you can't get the solution right. You can't get the antidote right. And the antidote isn't to say, how do we do a better apartheid? The antidote is to say, there is a reality of a Jewish Israeli population that is now multi-generational and isn't going anywhere. But what it cannot be is the carrier of a supremacist ethno-state that imposes itself on the Palestinian people indefinitely, whether through the zero-sum removal of Palestinians, whether through Bantustans and apartheid. You have to have the fundamental undoing of that system if you're ever going to have peoples who can live in peace and security and dignity, and if you're ever going to end up a state of war and an Israel that is a menace to the region around it as a consequence of how it manages itself in regard to the Palestinians.
Did you have another moment where the veneer also dropped for you? Do you want more water?
I'd love more water.
Let's get more water. And we'll keep this in as well.
Cheers.
Did you have another moment where the veneer also dropped off for you when you were dealing with Palestinian citizens of Israel? I believe there was a campaign under Ehud Barak that you were working on, and it involved you dealing with constituents or potential voters in Palestinian in areas where Palestinian citizens of Israel lived.
So I become more involved in the political scene, and I worked for someone who became the justice minister, but we were in opposition then, Yossi Beilin. And in the 1999 general election, which is where Ehud Barak comes to power, that is in a brief interregnum of Israeli political history where you voted both for a party to be represented in the parliament. Israel has a very pure version of proportional representation. So you vote for a party and seats are distributed in accordance with the percentage that party gets, okay? But for a short period of time in the 90s, very early noughties, you had a change to the system where you also directly elected the prime minister. It was, in terms of political systems 101, a real beginner's error, because you didn't actually set up a set of powers for the executive branch, but you kind of created a strange add-on to a parliamentary democracy that didn't work and was eventually scrapped. But anyway, a long way of saying that in 1999, in Ehud Barak's election, you voted both for a party and for your favored candidate for prime minister. To win that election, as had been the case in 96 when this was first introduced, and it was Shimon Peres after the assassination of Rabin running against Netanyahu, to win that election, the non-Netanyahu, non-right Labour candidate, this was when Israel was still much more resembling a two-party system, a big Labour Party and a big Likud Party. To win that, if you're not the right-wing candidate, you need the votes of today it's 20%, then it was slightly less, citizens of Israel with voting rights who are Palestinian Arab. In that election, you actually had a candidate from that community. He has gone on to set up an important institute in Doha since having to leave Israel on charges that don't seem particularly credible. Azmi Bashara. So Azmi is the candidate for Prime Minister of Israel in 1999. One of the many ways in which Azmi shows himself to be an original kind of creative thinker who challenged the system. The person I was with, who later became this minister, Beilin, was tasked, he was seen as a more progressive character at the time. He was tasked with Barak for mobilizing the vote amongst the, I'm calling it Palestinian Arab population. That's not what it was called in the meetings we were in. It was the minorities or the Arab minority. And to make sure that Azmi Bashara left the race. Eventually, Azmi does quit the race. So now it's all about getting the voters for the so-called Arab parties, Jabha Hadash, at the time, the Arab Democratic Party. I think there was another party. It was Tajamu. Balad was running then as well. To get their voters, which was Azmi's party, was Tajamu, to get their voters to vote for the parties and to use their second ballot of the direct election of the prime minister to vote for Ehud Barak. Mm-hmm. Just as that made the difference in the 1960 election, when Perez didn't get quite enough of those votes. It was a very tight election, Perez against Netanyahu. Perez, people may remember, there was Perez, first of all, having come into power after Rabin assassinated an important Hamas figure, Abu Ayash, which led to a wave of reprisal bombings. He then launches a war in Lebanon, Grapes of Wrath. There's a famous incident where a UN school in Kufr Khana. So nothing changes 30 years later. We're still doing exactly the same things. And Perez loses, as he deserved to, in that vote. Our job is to work in that sector. And so I spend that election campaign in the offices of those parties, getting to know those people in a much... I'd actually had more exposure probably prior to that to Palestinians from the occupied territories than I had to the community inside the 67 lines. Hugely successful. I'm not because of my efforts, just there was.
I'll give you credit. I'll give you credit, Danny.
I won't. So no, there was a decision by the parties.
Sure.
That they wanted to get Netanyahu out. Similar, by the way, it's the similar decision that they're going to face, and they will make the same call, very understandably, in 2026. That much as, and it's true, by the way, that much as we can sneer from the outside, what's the difference between Bennett and Smotrich Ben-Gvir? There is a difference between genocide and apartheid, and that's a real thing. So just to acknowledge that. So they did the responsible thing, if you like. They said, to keep out Netanyahu, we will vote with Barak. It's not that we believe deeply in Barak, but we assume that there are things that we can do with that government. By the way, the Rabin government had at least created a set of arrangements that were put on the table of the Knesset, a set of understandings with the Arab parties in 92. And there was an assumption that in 99, one might go back to that, not be part of the coalition, but have support from the outside. So when we won the election, and we're now in talks, what's the arrangement going to be? What coalition are you going to form? Barak forms about as right-wing a coalition as he could have formed under the circumstances. Okay, that's not great. But still, Mr. Prime Minister, what are you going to do with these parties who overwhelmingly their constituents voted for you? It's 95% plus of that population, not spoiled ballots. They voted for the guy. What are we going to do? Here's a paper. Here's some ideas. We've been speaking to them. This is, if you commit yourself to this, they don't really see themselves in the coalition. You don't see them in the coalition, but there can be arrangements from the outside. It's been done before. Here's nothing. No meeting. He called the heads of all the parties, maybe bar one on the Zionist side. Not even a meeting where we talked about how you choreograph the meeting. You say you can't be in coalition with them because they have this position on Jerusalem or whatever you want to say. They say we can't be in coalition with him because he has this. Let both sides come out with the narrative to their own publics, but agree to work on certain practical measures. Nothing. And that...
We've hit our target. We got the votes.
Yeah, exactly. Now, was I surprised? No. Was it still a punch to the gut? And
something must have happened.
It's not this. It's not linear.
Sure. Yes. It's not
those
linear.
little gradations where again the scales fall from one's eyes.
Another block gets added, basically. That takes me. You know what?
What?
To understand Israeli society from the outside, given all the polls that we see where you see the Israeli public, at least on the onset, they were in favor of what's been happening in Gaza. They were in favor against the war in Iran, in favor against the war in Lebanon. How much, from your experience, what you went through and what you know, how much is there, I guess, in the Israeli psyche, this concept of knowing and not knowing? The concept of being able to fully be aware of what is happening around you, specifically in regards to the Palestinians, what is happening in your name, and how much is actually shielded from you, or how much you're just unaware of. Like, the idea of reckoning, what weight does it have within Israeli society?
There are important historical layers to the absence of reckoning. So we can go the kind of quick and easy, quick and dirty route, if you like, and say, well, look at media ownership
look at
today.
The media, yeah.
It's even worse. Look at how mobilized.
You've called the media actually similar to Radio Rwanda in terms of the genocidal rhetoric.
Absolutely, and they should be called on it, and ideally they would be held accountable for it, and one day they should. And in many ways, it's even worse. This isn't Pravda. Right? This isn't a system controlled, manipulated in very strict legal ways from above. There is a significant degree of openness. They consciously choose not to challenge. Now, there's a cost for challenging, fine. You know, there are some exceptions, even in mainstream media, to that rule. But they are very few. And so we can go that easy route, and I can talk about the media climate. You can talk about, just the general shift further and further, the sucking sound of politics being pulled ever more rightwards. But I think you need to build up some additional layers. So while how we receive and consume and engage with information looks radically different today, I think you can still make a case that a society that refused to recognize Nakba, a society that looked at emptied out villages, a society that put people in the homes, that expropriated, that stole the homes, the existence of something in Israel called the apotropos, the custodian of absentee property. Why is the property absentee? Was there an earthquake? Did everyone go on an extended holiday? No, they were expelled in the Nakba. So I'm saying if you think of a society that going all the way back to the foundation of the state, a society that was comfortable with living next to abandoned villages, people not being allowed to go back to those, to living in the homes of people who had been expelled. And then you fast forward, and you add layer upon layer of denial of the injustice to Palestinians, of refusal to acknowledge it. Somehow we've gone from Nakba 1 to Nakba 2 without ever acknowledging that there was such a thing as a crime of Nakba. So that's where, for me, there are far more layers to understanding this today. And you cannot understand it, as far as I'm concerned, without the element of how the outside normalizes this.
Fair.
Impunity,
Fair, yeah.
But more than that. When Western leaders consistently come and they talk about our shared values, and they talk about Israel's security, and they are very mealy-mouthed in their words, in their rhetoric, let alone in their actions. When Israel participates in the Eurovision Song Contest still, when Israel participates in the Champions League, UEFA sport,
it can do all of that and get away with it, basically.
That sends the signal that at least amongst what we consider our peers, the global south, that's the. But at least amongst those we consider our equals, perhaps, they still get it. Ultimately, the message they're sending, sometimes they get excited, they get carried away with themselves, and they'll say something nasty. But essentially, by the way, when that gets reinforced by messages from the region, like the message the Abraham Accord sends, that is also a necessary tool for understanding how you generate that kind of consent but closeness and lack of inquisitiveness in a society.
So the reason why I asked you that, the question about reckoning, is because I was recently speaking to the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and we were having a conversation, and he said something to me that was I kind of stopped at, and I think you might disagree with it, but he doesn't believe reckoning will ever come within Israeli society. He just says it outright. He's like, there will be no reckoning from within Israeli society. It has to come through external pressure or external intervention. And he cites the South African apartheid model. I feel like you would disagree with it, but I do want to see what you make of that statement.
No, I do agree with Gideon, which is why...
Oh, you do agree?
Yeah. Well, perhaps with a caveat.
Okay.
Which is why...
Good, because I didn't want to make it look like I had a big misreading of you.
No. I'm glad. I'm glad we can address this. Which is why, for me, I lean into impunity. You can't do this without the outside. So where I agree 100% is it will not be generated from within. Let me maybe just expand on that very briefly, which is, if we're looking back at that historic trajectory, then how limited was the argument inside Israel that we have to end the occupation when there was a peace process, when there was some politics that was in the direction of deoccupation, let's say. How limited that was predicated on this is the right thing to do. This is the legal thing to do. These Palestinians deserve to be treated like equals to us. It was always much more about demographics. So the biggest argument in favor of withdrawal was if we don't withdraw, if there's a one state, then there'll be more Palestinians than us. And so it's the opposite of humanization.
The Jewish identity of the state.
So it's even in your clinching argument for peace, you're dehumanizing the other side. And in a way, it explains why I'm here and not there. If I thought you could change it from the inside, I would probably be there. But my realization was that you can't win an argument, probably under any comparable circumstances, when the signals being sent from the outside reinforce the default of the domestic debate, which is either we have to push on through in our maximalist project, or at least it's too hard. Even if I'm not comfortable with it, it's too hard to undo it. The flip side to that, and this is where I might, in part at least, separate ways from Gideon, is if there is sufficient pressure from the outside in terms of there being a cost, change the incentive structure. Rather than impunity, have some element of accountability, that you cannot live and be treated as normal if what you're doing is anything but normal. If that signal begins to be sent, then, and this may be me being Pollyannish, way over optimistic here, but then I think you can have a different debate inside Israel. You can begin to free up the space, at least, for some people to start saying, wait a minute, we've got a problem here. Our economy's being hit. We can't actually manage the same arms trade. We're not being able to buy the weapons that we need if we're going to do this maximalist stuff. It was nice when we could be in the Eurovision Song Contest. We like to...
So BDS would be effective in that way?
Absolutely. If BDS were more effective, we would arguably already not be where we are today. So that's because I think we have to be a bit honest here. Israel will not, I don't think, be sanctioned into changing its position. In a direct causal sanction, change position. It has to be mitigated through a middle thing. That middle thing is the debate in Israel changes. Okay? Imposition, if it's going to be imposition without the debate in Israel changing, without something that eventually looks like some kind of reckoning, okay? The alternative to that is that the military balance changes, is that Israel is deterred and contained and can no longer do what it is trying to do in a zero-sum way militarily. If the region, elements of the region, whatever, come together and impose a different military reality. So I just think we have to be honest about those things. It's always, or since I thought about it, it stuck with me that the one thing that was never allowed into the room of negotiations that I experienced and the ones that I didn't experience was any notion of a truth and reconciliation process, was any notion of reckoning, of any notion of how do we make something whole by interrogating what went on in the past.
When you said, you were saying that if you had believed that you were able to make some change, you wouldn't have left. You would have stayed there. When did you come to that decision to leave, or to, I guess, when did you come to that decision of thinking that, okay, you know, I can't approach this in the same way I have been the last number of years?
So as you see the erosion to today, absolute marginalization of an alternative political camp, and really such a strong consensus within the Zionist camp, and as it was increasingly clear that the politics internally was not going to shift until the geopolitics that they were having to respond to, the world outside shifted, which was a moment of rude awakening of how bad things were during the Bush administration. So the opportunity presented itself, and at the time I thought it would be relatively short term, and it was do some work in Washington. So I moved to DC, of trying to present a different narrative of why this is also bad for Israel to the US. You know, it's at the height of neocons, Iraq war, that kind of alignment. So I spent time in Washington. And then there was the decision not to go back. And then there was decision, okay, and then that gets wrapped up in things in one's own personal life. But I mean, what I can say is policy, to circle right back to the beginning of the conversation, policy won't change until the pressures brought to bear on policymakers change. And finally, we actually see something that looks hopeful and qualitatively different in the US. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there are, having the vast majority of the Democrat caucus back a Bernie Sanders initiated bill, which doesn't go nearly far enough, but just the thin end of the wedge of beginning to overwhelmingly, as the Democrats so far only, so it still didn't get through, support certain restrictions on sales of bombs and bulldozers to Israel. That's quite the change alongside the debate going on inside MAGA. So that has to be driven from the bottom up. You're going to have
young people as well.
And young people, and you're going, of course, the Dem establishment, let alone the GOP establishment, are going to hold out against that. Same story in Europe, where, although a lot of my work is with the US, I'm based in Europe. I was for a period of time at the largest pan-European think tank, working on the Europe. All of those things are not where I'd like them to be. There's an awfully long way to go. But if I finish that part of the journey, the other thing for me is we're no longer in a Western-centric world. So we're in a world of shifting geopolitics. A lot of what we're witnessing at the moment is the consequences of American decline anxiety. It's not going to reassert primacy and preponderance. And so actually a fair amount of my time and thinking and networking and outreach these days is not focused on the old West. It's the global South. And it's things like the Hate Group, which has actually, set out its stall on holding Israel accountable and how do you build a bigger coalition to do that. And that is absolutely centered in the global South and the shifting geopolitics of the era in which we live.
What does it mean to be an Israeli dissident today? I'm talking about the community of Jewish Israelis who are standing up for the Palestinian cause and taking quite a blunt stance and paying, that comes with a lot of weight, comes with a lot of repercussions as well. And I'm trying to get to that with you. What does it mean to be that person today?
And I think it is very different if you are there.
Absolutely.
And so I have huge respect and a lot of love for my friends who fall into that category. And understandably, there is a movement of people who are now doing that from the outside. But there are those who remain there.
But let's talk about that distinction. Why is it even? Why does it carry a lot more weight to be doing this from the inside?
I think that's always the case. I'd also say that we've danced around South Africa apartheid analogies a couple of times, and every situation is distinct. But if one gets back onto that dance floor very briefly, what you had in South Africa, which you don't have in this situation, is a clearly articulated liberation struggle led by the ANC and a freedom charter. And so there you had Jewish comrades who, here's our platform, here's the ANC platform. You have the BNC, you have BDS, but you have Palestinian civil society, but you don't have a political movement that those dissidents can, whether openly and probably be in hiding, or wink, wink, as allies, know what they're doing in terms of how you disrupt and deepen tensions and fissures in your society. But essentially, that's what they are trying to do. And of course, if you can have dissent from the inside, and sometimes it can be the very visible thing of refusing to serve and burning your conscription notice, which some young people do. But there are a cohort of people who know precisely what they're doing, who know that the problem is the regime, who know that what we need to do is de-Zionize, let's say, but they are doing things in ways where they're not burning the conscription notice, but they're playing on the potential cracks. They're playing to unravel this from within, sometimes in sophisticated ways. I don't want to exaggerate the degree of dissident activity. It is there, and for some, there's a belief and a commitment to the utility of doing that from within, and for others, this is my home. They've not got anywhere else to go. Many Israelis do have a second passport, but many don't. It's where their families are, one's personal circumstances. So perhaps even with a sense of futility. But what else am I supposed to do other than play that role? On the outside, you have a growing community of not Jewish diaspora, but of Israeli diaspora, of Israelis who now live in third countries. Germany is a fascinating one where you have, it's often Israelis and Jews being arrested for supposedly being anti-Semitic in their opposition to the practices of the Israeli state in a very, very authoritarian, actually, environment when it comes to these things. But on the outside, there's an ingredient which is less prevalent on the inside. On the outside, there is also a growing sense that the way to address Jewish well-being, actually, because in this entire conversation, what I haven't said, but what I want to be very clear about is, for me, this is also about the Jewish future. I have not deviated one iota from that person who, in their youth, was very proud to inherit being a member of the Jewish people, is very proud to be part of that line and to have been brought up with a universal Jewish ethic. And so for many of us who are not living there, this is also bound up with what does the Jewish future look like? What does Jewish well-being look like? Are we part of a struggle against anti-Semitism that's part of a struggle against racism? Or are we the spearhead actually for racism, where it's this Judeo-Christian civilizational struggle against Muslim immigrants, and it's the worst possible place for Jews to put themselves, but that's the struggle we're in now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could address it head on, because as I was asking you at the beginning of the conversation, what was your Jewish identity mean to you then? I guess, how has it evolved today? What does it look like to you now?
What it looks like to me now is that perhaps that youthfully naive thought that, well, if I just go to that state, go and live there, that's where the Jewish story is being lived out. That's my box ticked. That actually trying to prevent this move where somehow Jewish becomes synonymous with Israel, something being pushed primarily by the Israelis, by the supporters of Israel, Jewish synonymous with Israel, synonymous with the things Israel does, that is the biggest threat to us, to our future, to our well-being. We're having this conversation in London. It's been an incredibly shitty time. It not only in terms of the genuinely palpable sense of fear in the Jewish community here, but also how that has played out politically. Israel, I absolutely get it. Israel's a state. It does statecraft. It is undeniably in the interests of an Israeli state that wants to get away with the crimes it's committing against the Palestinians, to try and shift the conversation from Israeli criminality to anti-Semitism. So I get that for Israel to deploy, as one person described it in a recent interview, Barnaby Rain, to deploy Jewish communities almost as to use Israeli terminology, a human shield. I get how that makes sense for the state of Israel. I absolutely think that's reckless and irresponsible and wrong and should not be embraced at all, let alone enthusiastically, by so-called Jewish communal leaders. And the fact that you can have a Jewish communal rally against anti-Semitism in this country, which invites the leadership of the racist Reform UK party and refuses to invite the Jewish leader of the Green Party in this country, is absolutely indicative of what a terrible place we are. How Israeli priorities have overwhelmed Jewish communal capacity to think through our own interests and prioritize. And as I said, the way we are being used to advance a dangerous, racist, exclusivist agenda, which is not going to end up playing well for us. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But unfortunately, if you see things through the lens of the Zionist project, which has attached itself to Western powers historically, has attached itself to colonial powers historically, itself is a settler colonial project, then you understand how we would get to a place where it's being deployed like this. Huge mistake. And that's, so for me, if I could do it again, I think I'd want to be a rabbi and lead this from a place deeply embedded in how do I take this on theologically.
Well, that's going to be a round two then. That's going to be the start
when I'm
of
Rabbi Daniel
round
Levy,
two.
we can meet again.
Before I let you go, because I'm aware of your time, and you've touched on it, but if we can kind of bring it to a close, your fears of what's to come next. Something that you think about or keeps you up at night, let's say.
So partly it's the thing we just ended on, which is, and maybe it's not the thing that keeps me up at night, but it's one of the things that sends me with gritted teeth and clenched white knuckle fists going to sleep at night, is if I look at what constitutes mainstream Jewish communal political positionality on a lot of these questions, and it's that steam coming out the ears. How can you be in that position? How on earth does our history lead you to that place? And that for me is the greatest internal, not vis-a-vis Palestinians, Lebanese, others, but that's the greatest internal misstep and wrong of the Zionist project. But if I expand that horizon out, these people are serious. The people in power in Israel are serious, as should be very evidently the case by now, about pursuing this zero-sum project, about pursuing a project of expulsion and eradication and of domination in the region. And I think that's massive overreach, but it hasn't hit a wall yet. So it's only overreach when something sufficiently robust stands up against it and says, no further. I think they are way in over their heads in thinking they can dominate the region, in thinking that you can humiliate constantly the sensibilities of tens of millions of people in the region in which you have chosen to position yourself. And you humiliate them, of course, with what you do to the Palestinians, but with what you do elsewhere as well. You can't be serious about wanting to live in this region in peace and bomb Beirut in the way in which you did, and do the things on Al-Aqsa that you're doing. So what keeps me awake at night is either that they're successful and they have a nuclear weapon, by the way, that they're successful and this generates ever more suffering and explosion and tumult. Now, this isn't just, for me it was never just, the suffering of the Palestinians. We are now in a war that would not have happened without Israel and its megalomaniacal ambitions that America is waging with Israel against Iran, where everyone now pays an Israel impunity tax. Whether it's when you when you go on a flight, fill up with petrol, everything in the global economy. That's crazy. And it's even more crazy for a tiny country of a tiny people, in doing this in the name of a tiny people, for that to happen. So the fear that is the mirror image of what I just spelt out is that the blowback comes. And we don't course correct in time to prevent that blowback from being monumental. So for me, it really is a moment where there is a shared interest here on the Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian regional side to step back from this madness.
And we're going to leave it here.
So we are.
Yeah, we are. But man, was this a heavy conversation. Man, did I enjoy this. Daniel Levy. No, thank you, honestly. Thank you.
No, you got me to talk about things I don't talk about normally.
Well, there we go.
Bravo to you.
Daniel Levy, thank you so much for coming on Real Talk. I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Really.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers, Mohamed.